Okay, we'll begin again, and this time we're probably delving into the most difficult part of this book to understand, or the most difficult part maybe for us nowadays to be comfortable with. Going back to this sort of outline of the book that I've given you, Teresa has brought us to this point where she begins to live the life of Jesus Christ within her. And chapter 22, which you haven't got really the time to look at in any detail, she sort of makes a very strong statement there of the central place of Jesus Christ in the life of a Christian, in the prayer life of a Christian. Jesus, human and divine. Because the spiritual life, the life of prayer, is always a relationship between the divine and the human, God and the person. It's always going to be that. And while we can, maybe, to a certain extent, have an understanding of our part. We can learn to do this and that. We can commit ourselves to our lives of prayer, our Christian lives. But, as we see here, and as we know, the principal part, the most important part, is the divine, what God is doing. We've already saw this morning that when she begins to speak about prayer, her starting point is God's love for us. We have to know we're loved. And his friendly conversation with the one that we know loves us. That's what prayer is. Friendship, conversation of friendship with the one that we know loves us. And the one who loves us communicates with us. And this is where the difficulty comes in. Because clearly the divine is outside of our realm. In chapter 22, Teresa makes something very, very clear, and that is that we're not angels, we're humans. And we do not try to be angels. We've got bodies. We're human beings. Our feet are on the ground. We shouldn't try to be anywhere else. We experience God as human beings. We're not angels. But the wonderful gift of Jesus Christ is that he is both divine and human. And in the historic context, or the church context that Teresa lived in, there was tendencies in certain teachers to say, when you advanced in prayer, then you sort of left aside the humanity of Jesus and tried to relate with Jesus as divine. But she said, no, he's both divine and human. We must never depart from the humanity of Jesus. The cross. That's the greatest place to be, the foot of the cross. This is the life of those who are closest to Jesus in the Gospels. So Teresa is firmly rooted in the Gospels, in the Scriptures, in Jesus as he's revealed to us there. Now, what I want to come to since if we look at the way I've structured this here, from chapter 23 then onwards, up to chapter 31, is this life of meeting with Jesus. This new life. I want to have a look at a little bit of this. And Teresa is, I sort of focused a little bit on this last night. She's caught in this sort of dilemma between what should be happening in the thinking of those who are experts and what really is happening. The path that she is on. I want to read a little bit here of this. This is from chapter 26, it's number 5 in chapter 26. She's read her prayer. As often as the Lord commanded something of me in prayer, and my confessor told me to do otherwise, the Lord returned and told me to obey my confessor. Afterwards, His Majesty would change the confessor's mind and he would agree with the Lord's command.
Love it.
It's a lovely way of putting the kind of struggle that was going on. And indeed goes on in everybody's spiritual life. The human and the divine. And God speaks through both. Any one of us, at any time, can feel called by God to do something. Some sense of calling, of vocation. But we need human advice, human counsel, human wisdom. Otherwise we could be going astray. It may not be of God. God speaks through both, through the inspiration that He gives to the person and the advice and counsel of others who are in God's name, in God's place. But the other is equally those who are the so-called experts, advisors, leaders in the church can be controlling and manipulating and not allowing the Spirit to speak or trying to control what the Spirit is saying in a person. So here is Teresa caught in this. The Lord is speaking to her, calling her, inspiring her, communicating with her. She has experts and confessors and spiritual directors telling her something else. And the advice always is, go, obey them, obey. But the Lord, if something is truly of the Lord, they will come round. And she has this experience over and over again in her life. And particularly in later years when she's making her foundations and will I do this, will I not do it, and consult, she would always look for some inspiration from the Lord to do it. But she would never act until her advisors and superiors and counsellors and bishops and theologians and whoever advised her to do it. The human and the divine are always, both have to be there. Cannot separate one from the other. So that's kind of what's going on here. And now these humans do something, I don't know what the right word is, catastrophic. I've already mentioned this, take you the books from her. Let's hear her account of this. So, this is all very fine, the confessors and afterwards and obeying, but now she goes on. When they forbade the reading of many books in the vernacular, I felt that prohibition very much. So this would have been really tested, this principle that she was living by. Would have been traumatic for this woman who loved books to have, because Teresa mentions, Teresa was to a certain, she could read and write, she was highly intelligent, she did not have formal education, she understood some Latin, even though she says she didn't, but she certainly understood some, but not enough to be able to read in Latin, and of course the books in her own language were taken from her. So, she said, I felt the prohibition very much, because reading some of them was an enjoyment for me, and I could no longer do so since only Latin editions were allowed. The Lord said to me, don't be sad. I shall give you a living book. I was unable to understand why this was said to me, since I had not yet experienced any visions. So I've already spoken a bit about that and Jesus becoming the living book for her. But what's also very significant here is she had no visions before this traumatic experience. And we try to make some sense of these visions that Teresa has. We've got to connect them with this. They only had, prior to this, she had no visions. It was only after this traumatic experience when so many of the helps and supports that she had were removed from her. And she has to rely at a much deeper level upon Jesus Christ, upon his presence. She has to trust. Her trust is tested here very profoundly. The human experts, leaders of the church that she feels so strongly part of, are acting in a way that to her is incomprehensible, very painful, removing the very helps and support she most needs, but to trust in God here. So we're in 1559. Into 1560. And what I want to have a look at is just to delve in here to chapter 27 and have a look at this chapter. Help us to make some sense of this whole area of how she navigated these experiences of God. Well, to return to the account of my life, I was enduring this difficult affliction. And, as I've said, many prayers were being offered up to the Lord might lead me by another safer path, since this one, they told me, was so suspect. So tell you that the path she's on is so suspect. But she's prayed, Lord, lead me on a safer path, but The truth of the matter is that even though I was beseeching God, and however much I wanted to desire another path, it wasn't in my power to desire it. So she's praying for something, but she doesn't really want what she's praying for. She had not even in her power to desire what she's praying for. But the experts are telling her she's on a wrong path, so she better pray for the right path. But it is not even in her power to desire another path, because the Lord is giving her this reassurance. And why is she so reassured? She's so reassured because she said, I saw I was a completely different person. I could not desire another path, but I placed myself in the hands of God that he would carry out his will completely in me. He knew what suited me. So she's going in here to a much deeper place of trust. These circumstances, these events, she are pushing her into a... But she's praying, and she's on the one hand praying for another path, but on the other hand knows that this is the will of God. And she's praying to her saints, she said, invoking saints, making novenas, all of this. And then there comes an event that I won't just say changes Teresa's life, because we've seen there's a number of these events along, but it's really the one that confirms the change that's taking place. It's if we're to think of Teresa in terms of conversion, it's not just one event, there's a series of events. And this one is, some commentators call it the decisive event, the one that somehow defies everything. And I'm going to read first what she tells us it is, and then trying to make. After 2 years of these prayers of mine, and those of others offered up for this said intention, which she doesn't want to have fulfilled, here's what happens. Being in prayer on the feast day of the glorious St. Peter, I saw, or to put it better, I felt Christ beside me. I saw nothing with my bodily eyes or with my soul, but it seemed to me that Christ was at my side. I saw that it was he, in my opinion, who was speaking to me. So, she sees, or she doesn't see, Jesus Christ beside her. But she said, I saw nothing with bodily eyes or with my soul. So it is seeing, but it's not seeing. And this is, she now has to, for several paragraphs here in a sense, try to convince herself of what's taking place and find a way of expressing it. So let's go on a little bit more here. It seemed to me that Jesus Christ was always present at my side. So she sees him outside this one occasion, but what is really shown is that he's always there. He's always at her side. But since it wasn't an imaginative vision, I didn't see any form. Yet I felt very clearly that he was always present at my side, and that he was the witness of everything I did. At no time in which I was a little recollected or not greatly distracted was I able to ignore that he was present at my side. I immediately went very anxiously to my confessor to tell him. He asked me in what form I saw him. I answered that I didn't see him. He asked how I knew it was Christ. I answered that I didn't know how, but that I couldn't help knowing that he was at my side. and I saw and felt him clearly, that my recollection of soul was greater, and that I was very continuously in the prayer of quiet, that the effects were much different from those I usually experience, and it was very clear. I could do nothing but draw comparisons in order to explain myself. And she goes on to try and do this, for I say that I see it with eyes neither of body nor of soul, because it's not an imaginative vision, nor do I know and affirm that he is more certainly at my side than I saw him. It's incorrect to think that the vision is like that experience of those who are blind or in the dark, who don't see the other at their side. There's some likeness in this comparison, but not a great deal, because in such a case these people experience with their senses. Either they hear the other person speak or stir, or they touch them. In the vision there's nothing of this, nor do you see darkness, but the vision is represented through knowledge given to the soul that is clearer than sunlight. I don't mean that you see the sun or brightness, but that a light, without your seeing light, illumines the intellect, so the soul may enjoy such a great good. So, language fails her here. It's the one time I know of in Teresa's writings where she cannot come up with an image. Right throughout her writing, she's always going to come up with an image for whatever she wants to say, even at the highest of mysticism and the most difficult things. She always come up with an image to explain. Here she can't. She completely fails to come up with an explanation. Yet she's absolutely certain. More certain than seeing a person, more certain than hearing, more certain than sunlight, more certain than and absolute certainty that this is Jesus. He's at her side. Yet it's not anything seen. It's not imagination. It's not a dream. It's not any kind of a vision in a sense of seeing something or hearing something. But there's a certainty to the experience, and it changes her. And the sure sign that she always uses is the good effects that it has upon her. So she struggles to explain this. And of course, the struggle to explain it, there's two dimensions to it. She has to try and explain to herself. She has to express it. Experience of God has to be expressed. We have to find some words or images. Elsewhere in this book, back in the midst of her treatise on prayer, which we haven't looked at, she gives us an important principle about the experience of God. She tells us that many people have these experiences. Very few know what they are, and fewer still are able to express them. Teresa gradually over time grows into having those three gifts. Has the experience? Yes. As many people have, many people everywhere in life have. Very few know what they are. And fewer again can put words on them, can express them. So we can see here, she knows what it is. She knows with absolute certainty it is Jesus. But she can't find the words or the imagery or anything to explain it. So she tried to explain it to herself because she needs a verse. But she's got the problem with these confessors. She's got to convince them. She's got to tell them. And so that's the second problem she's got here. The other thing she tells us about this experience and trying to, it says nothing like other kinds of experiences of God, like somebody like feel great fervour or feel a very closeness to God, she said, in prayer and different kinds of prayer. Person might have an experience that God is very close. This is nothing like that. This is not at any feelings level. There's no feelings here. There's none of the senses are any way involved here. So there's no feeling here. There's something. As she goes on, the poor confessor, then she has to try and convince. She said, then the confessor asked me, who said it was Jesus Christ? He told me many times, I answered. But before he told me, he impressed upon my intellect. It was he. And before doing this latter, he told me he was present, but I didn't see him. So she has to try and convince the confessor of this. So she used this, Lord, being engraved upon the intellect. This very strong expression that she used. The Lord desires to be so engraved upon the intellect that this vision can no more be doubted than can what is seen, and even less. So engraved that it can't even something that's seen could be doubted, but this cannot be doubted. This is a characteristic of an experience of God that she gives various, but it cannot be doubted. The person just cannot doubt it. Nobody can talk a person out of this. This is so engraved. But it hasn't come from any human, it's not anything, it's the divine and the human. The divine so engraved, there's a certainty here. It doesn't mean, of course, that she can now depart from human means, human advice, human support, human help. She needs that very much. Hence the real struggle to explain it, some explanation that she herself could be comfortable with, that would succumb some way to expressing something of the truth which what has taken place, and she can't do that. She fails to do that. Something that she can explain to her confessor, convince him. We'll struggle to do that. So what else is there? She goes on then to say that this is another way that God has of communicating. She said, hence there's another way in which God teaches the soul and speaks to it. Different from the manner of speaking described previously. It is a language that belongs so to heaven that here on earth it's poorly understood, no matter how much we may desire to tell about it, if the Lord does not teach us through experience. So she goes on, this experience. If we've experience, we know the truth of it. There's, on the one hand, there is truth that can be written about, can be explained, can be taught. There's another kind of truth that can only be known by experience. If it's not known by experience, it will seem illogical, unreasonable, contradictory, paradoxical to those who are reliant on what can be taught through experience. So she now, in a sense, takes a leap from her struggle to explain, to say, those who have experience will know, will understand. This is a different, we're dealing with something, a different language, a language that belongs to heaven, not to earth. So to try and explain the language of heaven, to translate it into the language here on earth, just can't be done. It'd be so poorly understood. So the Lord puts what he wants the soul to know very deeply within it, and there he makes this known without image or explicit words. So there's no image, there's no words. but it's known. Because at a human level, everything we know, we have to have an image or words. We can't deal with it otherwise. But here, there's neither. And this manner in which God gives the soul understanding of his desires and great truths and mysteries is worthy of close attention. Often this is the way I understand when His Majesty explains some vision he wishes to represent to me. So, the Lord wants to, the Lord is speaking to her, God, and she then goes on to say, the devil cannot get in here. This can't be mistaken. Because it's not coming in any human way. So she goes on to try to doubt this a little bit more. That God, she's trying to explain God communicating himself, the presence of Jesus in her life, and goes on then to also the mystery of the Trinity, the whole reality of God, and how we might know this. So then, we better move on. Then she goes on to, in a sense, bring us into another dimension of this. Returning then to a discussion of this kind of understanding, it seems to me that the Lord in every way wants this soul to have some knowledge of what goes on in heaven. I think that just as in heaven you understand without speaking, which I certainly never knew until the Lord in his goodness desired that I should see and showed himself to me in a rapture, so it is in this vision. For God and the soul understand each other only through the desire his majesty has that it understand. So, understand the lover. This must be, so these two lovers gaze directly at each other. That's the thing she takes from the Song of Songs. Then, as she so often does in her book, she'll switch from addressing the reader to God. There's a lovely little prayer in here to express this. O admirable kindness of God, you allow me to gaze upon you with eyes that have so badly gazed as those of my soul. May they, Lord, become accustomed through this vision not to look at base things, so that nothing outside of you might satisfy them. O ingratitude of mortals, to what extremes will you go? For I know, through experience, that what I say is true, and that what can be said is the least of what you do, Lord, for a soul you bring to such frontiers. So she's calling to God now, saying, I know what you're doing is true. I know what you're saying is true. O souls that have begun to practice prayer and have true faith, what good things can you still seek in this life, leaving aside what is gained for eternity that could compare with the least of these favours? So God, what God is giving. Reflect that it is indeed certain that God gives himself in this way to those who give up all for him. He shows no partiality. He loves everyone. Nobody can have any excuse, no matter how miserable they may be, since the Lord acts with me in bringing me to this state. So, anyone who disposes themselves, who gives up everything for him, he does it. Even she herself, the mercy of God. So now, she comes to the next issue. She's been trying to explain it for herself. She's been trying to explain it for her confessors. Now, another dimension. This must be taught. This experience is not for her. It's for teaching. So she addresses the confessor that she's most writing this book for, Garcia de Toledo. She never names him here, but she says, Your Reverence ought to cry out these truths, since God has taken from me the freedom to do so. Because she can't teach, being a woman, she can't preach. She hasn't the freedom to, but Your Reverence has. Father Garcia de Toledo, and indeed the other confessors and experts and whatever, they must cry out this. They must teach this. So now she has gone from being totally unable to explain something, trying to convince her confessors that this was okay, turning to God for his reassurance, and now saying to her, you've got to teach this. You've got to use this in teaching. You've got to use this in your work of preaching. So important is this. I should like them to be proclaimed to me always. Yet I've been so slow myself to hear and understand God, as will be seen in what is written here, that is very embarrassing to speak about this. As a result, I desire to be silent. So, reverting back after saying, you're to speak, back to our side. I shall only say what sometimes comes to mind. May it please the Lord to bring me to the goal that I might enjoy this blessing. So, once this taught, but she's going to step back herself and let it be. So she wants everyone to know about this. And then she goes on to something else. When she had this experience, in 1561, around then, she turned for advice and reassurance to Peter de Alcantara. By the time she's writing this, he has died. But his support for her was vital at this time. His reassurance. And so she now relies on that. Though he's dead, she gives us a big long section here, almost a hagiography of this man and of his life, and what a wonderful man he was and what a loss he is since he has died. But it's really her way of saying to anybody who doubts this, if such a great saint had it, why could it not happen to me? But more importantly, if such a great saint knew and understood this and supported it and taught it, then it must be taught. It must be spoken about. So she's coming to this that this must now be spoken about. And so she gives a long section here on this man that's to support this teaching that she's got here. And then she concludes, but what a discourse I've got into. She knew exactly what she was getting into. This is really Teresa at her very best. May it awaken your reverence. Again, this word awakening. God has been doing the awakening several times. God awakening. Now may what I've said awaken your reverence. She is, without any doubt, now become his spiritual director. Makes no apologies for it. May it awaken your reverence, so that you will not esteem anything pertaining to this life, what she's put into that prayer in the middle of this, that you will, as though you didn't know and weren't already determined to abandon all, and hadn't already put this renunciation to pursue. You're already doing this, but you've got to accept this now. She's teaching him that. I see so much perdition in the world that even though my writing about it brings me no more benefit than to tire me out, I find rest in doing so. She liked writing this chapter. I find rest in doing so. There's a few other times in her writings where she tells us that. When she's writing about something, it's a real sign Teresa considers what she's writing here very important. So difficult, something very difficult to write about, struggles, but I don't tire writing about it. She likes, she liked, I find rest in doing so. She struggled at the very extremities of language here, can't come up with comparisons, knows that she's really up against it to convince those who have the power over her here that this is okay. The audacity to say they should use this in teaching, but she liked writing about it. This is because this is the thing. For everything I've written is against myself. Camouflage again, she's, well, I'm only a little woman here, camouflaging. It's not against herself at all, but it's the way she has put in this, but she likes this. But it is in another sense, the sense that it is total mercy of God. This is nothing here that she has done anything to bring about. Total gift of God, mercy of God. May the Lord pardon me for my offences against him in this matter, and may your reverence do so, for I tire you unintentionally. That's his reverence. It appears that I want you to do penance for my sins in this matter. She's exhorting this man. It's a marvellously written chapter, where this woman has the courage and the audacity to probe the very depths of the relationship between Jesus and us as human beings. Speak about it and teach about it. This is how Jesus, she's come to see, is working in her life. If he works like this in her life, then he works like this, not in imitation of her, but in a very real and very profound way in everyone's life. And I mentioned already, I think last night, that one of the great discoveries Teresa makes in writing this book is that her experience can be used for teaching. And here she's, despite how difficult it is to write about this, she knows it's important to write it because it can be used in teaching. It's needed. Okay, I think we've probably done enough for this evening. We've probably done. But that's just dipping into this particular part of the book which many people find difficult. Find vision, this woman talking about visions and all of these experiences, what's it all about? But it's taking us to the reality of God and what prayer truly is. It's the relationship, the communication between the divine and the human. And the more we as human beings go into this, the more incomprehensible it becomes, but also the more real it becomes, and the more good that it does. And consequently, the greater the need there is for this to be proclaimed, to be taught, to be spoken about, to be used in help, because the world, she comes back to the world and how much the world needs this and how everything else in the world is worthless beside what this is. Amen. We'll come back to it. Up again tomorrow. Good, good.